Yo, you got a mic? What's going on, guys? Back here with another banger video, and in today's video, we are going to be discussing Spider-Man villains who deserve a second chance and a new adaptation. There's a lot of Spider-Man villains who have made it to live action. Some of them have been absolutely incredible, like Green Goblin, Doc Ock, Vulture, and Mysterio. Even characters like Sandman and Electro have had their moments. But then there are other villains, the ones where you watch the movie and think, how did they mess this up? Because Spider-Man has one of the greatest rogues galleries in comic book history, and yet some of his most interesting villains have gotten adaptations that completely miss what makes them special. So today I want to talk about 3 Spider-Man villains who desperately need another shot at live action. And I'm not just talking about villains who had a bad movie, I'm talking about characters where the adaptation completely missed the point, the character. And honestly, some of these characters I would love to see brought into a future Spider-Man movie or even an MCU Spider-Man series. But before we dive into the video, make sure to like, subscribe, comment, share, and turn on that notification bell so you never miss one of my banger uploads. With all that out of the way, let's get right into it. Let's start with the Lizard. Now, on paper, the Lizard in The Amazing Spider-Man sounds pretty accurate. You got Curt Connors, he's a scientist, he's missing an arm, he's experimenting with reptilian regeneration. The experiment goes wrong, and he becomes a giant humanoid lizard. Sounds like the Lizard, right? Well, sort of, because the biggest problem with this adaptation isn't necessarily the basic origin, it's Curt Connors himself. Curt Connors isn't interesting just because he's a scientist who turns into a giant lizard. The entire tragedy of the character comes from his life outside of being the lizard. He's a husband, a father, and a brilliant scientist who is desperate to overcome his disability. And his desire to regain his arm isn't supposed to just be, I want my arm back because having 2 arms would be more convenient. There's much more emotion behind it. His family, his insecurities, and his desire to feel whole again are all important parts of why he makes the decision that will eventually turn him into the lizard. And that's something the movie doesn't really explore. In fact, his family is completely absent, and that is a huge problem because how are you going to adapt Curt Connors without giving us the people who are supposed to matter most to him? His transformation should feel tragic. We should be watching a man who thinks he's doing something that will improve his life only for that decision to destroy the life he already had. Instead, the movie mostly turns him into a generic scientist who becomes a monster and wants to turn everyone else into one too. That's a perfectly functional superhero movie villain, but it's not the best version of the Lizard. And then there's Spider-Man's relationship with Connors. Peter and Connors should have a genuine connection. Peter is a young scientist who looks up to Connors, and Connors sees potential with Peter. There's supposed to be an actual relationship there before everything goes wrong. That makes the transformation hurt. Instead, the relationship is barely given enough time to develop, and visually, I think it's a consensus that the Lizard could have looked much better. The character needed more of a classic comic book identity, the lab coat, the more recognizable snout, and a design that actually made him look like Curt Connors transformed into the Lizard rather than just a giant CGI monster. So if Marvel ever brings the Lizard back, I don't want another generic monster. I want Curt Connors, give him his family, a relationship with Peter, and a real emotional reason for becoming the Lizard, and make the villainy a consequence of his tragedy. That's how you get a great Lizard adaptation. Next up is Rhino, and honestly, I feel bad for Rhino fans because this character has been adapted twice, and somehow neither version has really given us the Rhino we actually want. In The Amazing Spider-Man 2, Rhino is basically a guy inside a giant mechanical rhino suit, and in Kraven the Hunter, they took the character in a completely different direction. But here's the thing. Rhino is more interesting than big guy, very strong, punches Spider-Man. That's the surface level version of Rhino. And unfortunately, that's basically all the movies have given us. One of the most interesting parts of Rhino's comic book character is that he doesn't necessarily want to be Rhino forever. The suit can become a prison. he can become trapped by the identity he's created for himself. That's actually a really interesting concept for a Spider-Man villain. Imagine introducing Rhino as this intimidating criminal who thinks becoming Rhino is going to make him powerful. He gets the suit, he becomes incredibly strong, he fights Spider-Man, and then, over time, he realizes, I don't want this anymore. Now you've got something, because Spider-Man isn't just about defeating villains. Peter Parker is constantly trying to help people, and Rhino could actually be one of the perfect examples of a villain who Spider-Man is trying to rehabilitate rather than simply destroy. You could even make Rhino a recurring villain. Maybe he's the villain of one movie, Spider-Man defeats him, Rhino goes to prison, then later in the franchise we see him again, but this time he's trying to get out of the life. Maybe he's finally free of the suit and he's trying to live normally, or maybe another villain forces him back into the Rhino identity. That gives the character an actual arc, and it makes Rhino feel like a person rather than a boss battle, and I think that's the biggest thing missing from the live action versions. Alexei Sietsevich, I'm pretty sure I pronounced that right, needs to exist underneath the Rhino, because if you only care about the Rhino suit, you're missing the character. The next adaptation needs to make us care about the man inside the suit. That's when Rhino could finally become a genuinely great Spider-Man villain. And finally, for the last villain, Carnage. This might be the most frustrating of all, because Venom, Let There Be Carnage, had an absolutely insane amount of potential. You had Cletus Cassidy, Carnage, Venom, and Shriek. You have one of the most dangerous villains in Spider-Man's entire universe, and somehow the movie doesn't really feel like a Carnage story. The biggest problem is Cletus himself. Carnage is supposed to represent chaos and absolute freedom. Cletus doesn't want to live by society's rules, he doesn't want to be controlled, and he doesn't want anyone telling him what he can and can't do. That's what makes him so terrifying. But Let There Be Carnage puts so much emphasis on his relationship with Shriek that it takes the attention away from what actually makes Cletus unique. And then there's the relationship between Cletus and the Carnage symbiote. This is supposed to be one of the most important parts of Carnage's identity. Venom and Eddie are two beings who eventually develop a partnership. Cletus and Carnage are something much more unified. They're supposed to feel like they're on the same wavelength. They aren't constantly arguing about what they want, they are Carnage. And that's why the movie's portrayal feels so strange. The relationship between Cletus and Carnage should be one of the most disturbing parts of the character. Instead, the movie makes them feel like they're constantly fighting over control. And then there's the fact that Carnage is one of the most violent characters in Spider-Man's entire universe. I'm not saying the movie needed to become an endless gore fest, but Carnage should feel dangerous. When this guy enters a scene, you should immediately feel like something terrible could happen, and that's the entire point. And there are actually some moments where the movie gets close. There are some genuinely creepy Carnage moments. The problem is that they don't make up for the larger issues with the character, and I think that's why Carnage needs another adaptation more than almost anyone, because the potential is insane. Imagine a darker Spider-Man story where Cletus isn't just another villain of the week. Imagine Spider-Man slowly realizing that this isn't someone he can simply talk down. Imagine Venom being forced to work with Spider-Man because Carnage is genuinely too dangerous for either of them to handle alone. Now that is a Carnage story I want to see. And that's really the common problem with all three of these characters. The movies adapted their powers and appearances, but not always the characters underneath them. The Lizard isn't just a giant lizard, he's Curt Connors. Rhino isn't just a giant guy in armor, he's Alexei Shishevich. And Carnage isn't just a red symbiote, he's Cletus Cassidy. That's the difference between making a character look accurate and actually adapting the character. And honestly, that's what I want from the next generation of Spider-Man movies. Don't just ask, what does this villain look like? Ask, why is this person a villain? Because that's where the best Spider-Man stories come from. So if Marvel ever decides to bring these three back, I really hope they don't just remake what we've already seen. Give us a completely different take. Give us a Lizard who actually feels like Curt Connors. Give us a Rhino who feels like a real person trapped behind the monster, and give us a Carnage who actually feels like one of the most dangerous villains Spider-Man has ever faced. Because these characters deserve another chance, and if they're done right, they could easily become some of the best villains in live action. But what do you think? Which Spider-Man villain do you think needs the biggest live action redemption? Let me know in the comments. And if you enjoyed this video, make sure to like, subscribe, share, and turn on that notification bell so you never miss one of my banger uploads. And I'll see you guys in the next one.